So I think we can start very soon. So as I mentioned, this meeting is being recorded, so if I can ask that you keep your microphones off during the meeting until the question and answer session. I'll stop the recording once William has finished with his presentation. So then you're welcome to ask questions then. And it is 6. So welcome to the June evening talk of the Western Cape branch of ARCSOC. Tonight we are pleased to have William Martinson joining us, all the way from Eastern Cape. And so he graduated from the University of the Witwatersrand with a Bachelor of Architecture in 1987 and a Master of Architecture Conservation in 1989. He was appointed as architect by the then National Monuments Council in 1989 and joined Osmond Longer Architects in 1997, moving to the firm's East London office in 2006. He has worked on numerous heritage projects, including the documentation of historic buildings and structures, as well as a compilation of numerous heritage impact assessments and heritage management guidelines. He is a member of the East London Museum Board, chairman of the Board of Historical Society of East London, and an ongoing collaborator on the artifacts.co.za website. Really looking forward to hearing the talk about Christina Forsyth. I think it's going to be a really interesting one. Thanks, William.
Right, thank you very much for that introduction. So this is a revised and adapted version of a talk that was delivered to the Border Historical Society of East London. Additional images taken in a rock shelter when investigating a possible depiction of Christina Forsyth have been included for additional archaeological interest. So I must acknowledge various important contributions to this search. Fellow fossickers of the Border Historical Society, including Patrick Hutchison, Mike Kenyon, Viv Mostert, Mike Coleman, and Donald Davies. For those of you not familiar with the word fossick, it is slang to search for something amongst other things, especially in a persistent or determined way. Then Victor Biggs, late enthusiast of rock art in the Eastern Cape, who assisted in the process. Ben McClellan of Dordrecht for providing de-stretched versions of the rock art images. John Ross of Drumnadrochit in Scotland for sharing his biographical research on Christina Forsyth and locating the elusive clue to find the Xolobe mission station. Derek Peters, an elder of the Cairney Hill Parish Church in Scotland, for sharing information about the site where Christina spent an early part of her life. Then the Corey Library at Rhodes University for providing scanned manuscripts relating to Patterson Mission Station and to Middle Xolobe Mission Station. And finally, the African Historical Maps collection at UCT for providing a high resolution of a 1916 survey drawing. So the talk will commence with an abbreviated timeline of Christina Forsyth's life to give a broader context and to note some of the principal events. Then I will present selected highlights of the 3 trips we undertook into the Transkei. Interspersed with the outcomes of the search process, I will present various extracts from the Forsyth biography, the plan of the Patterson Mission Church, a suggested plan reconstruction of the Xolobe Mission House, and some thoughts on the likely form of the Xolobe Mission Church. So our first trip took place in September 2021, and on that trip we documented the rock art in the Xolobe River Valley, possibly depicting Christina Forsyth. We also searched for the Middle Xolobe Mission Station at the incorrect site and instead found St. Stephen's Anglican Church. Our second trip was about a year later when we visited the Mbulu Patterson Mission Station and Noloza Art Station in Upper Xolobe. And then in February 2023, we made the connection with the researcher John Ross in Scotland. And in March 2023, the site of the Middle Xolobe Mission Station had been confirmed. And then the third trip took place May 2023, and we successfully visited the mission station. And then I'll just conclude with a few points. So to give some context to the title of Christina Forsyth of Fingoland, I present this map of the so-called native districts in 1892, comprising Transkei, Tembuland, and Griqualand East. And note that the map does not observe normal topographical conventions, and the north point faces up to the top left-hand corner. The map was included in the Cape of Good Hope Civil Service list of 1892. The chief magistracy of the Transkei is the green hatched area, and that comprises of three sub-areas, the Iduchwa Reserve, Galekaland, and Fingoland, the last being occupied by Fingos, also known as the Mfengus. Note also that Ponderland was not yet then annexed to the Cape Colony, and this only took place in March 1894. So the approximate site of Christina Forsyth's mission station at Middle Xolobe was just to the southwest of Tsomo. You can see right at the bottom of the Transkei area, close to the convoluted outline of the Great Kai River, is Tsomo, and her site is just to the southwest of Tsomo. So Christina Forsyth, just an abbreviated timeline. She was born on 23rd of October 1844 as Christina Moya, schooled in Glasgow, and by 1876 she was keeping house for her brother, Reverend John Moya, at Cairney Hill Parish Church in West Fife, Scotland. While there, she was engaged to Alan Forsyth in 1878, and in 1879 left Britain as a voluntary mission worker for the United Presbyterian Church. And in South Africa, she assisted at the school at Mgwali Mission and later at Patterson Mission at Mbulu, and returned to Scotland in 1881, aged 36. And this photograph is of her aged about 25, extracted from the biography of her. So then to continue, she married in September 1882 to Alan Forsyth, who was a mining engineer, and the couple then moved to Leidenburg in the Transvaal from 1882 to 1885. Alan died in February 1885, and Christina then returned to Patterson Mission at Mbulu in 1886 and requested to be the missionary at Xolobe. A mission house was built for her in 1899, funded by the Greenock Ladies Kaffrarian Society. In 1900, the mission school was handed over to the government, and a wooden iron church was constructed at the mission in 1905. And Christina retired in 1916 to Scotland after 30 years at Middle Xolobe. She died in Scotland in 1919, aged 75. And just as a postscript, in 1954, the mission station, the school, and the surrounding residents were all relocated by the Bantu Development Trust as part of a so-called betterment scheme. So a portrait photograph of Christina Forsyth was taken at age 72, shortly after her return to Scotland after the 30 years at Middle Xolobe. On the day, she appeared at a debriefing before the Foreign Mission Committee. She is seated and stares intently at the camera. Note particularly her headgear, which appears to be a black beret with a narrow folded and sewn leather band around the base. A circular badge, possibly that of the United Free Church of Scotland, is mounted centrally on her beret. She wears a black mourning veil folded up over her beret. The significance of this manner of dress will become clear later in the talk. Her overcoat is noteworthy. This appears to be made from a dark, heavy linen or canvas, and it was almost certainly oiled to make it waterproof. This suggestion is based on the manner in which the cloth does not fall easily, but forms clear undulations in the surface of the fabric. The scarf is very clearly of a dark animal fur. The long stick she holds in her right hand is definitely of Eastern Cape origin, a much longer version of the traditional Xhosa knobkerrie, evidenced by the carefully carved and modulated spherical top, and this was almost certainly made for her in Middle Xolobe. Christina Forsyth formed the subject of two articles by Denise Fielding, published in the Border Historical Society's Coelacanth Journal. The first was titled Smoyana, Part 1, 1844 to 1879, published in 2000, and made reference to the possible depiction of Christina Forsyth in a rock art shelter in the Xolobe River Valley. And the article also referred to the biography by W.P. Livingston titled Christina Forsyth of Fingoland, the story of the loneliest woman in Africa. And then the second article by Fielding was titled Smoyana Part 2, and that was published in 2002. And then Dr. Patrick Hutchison's more recent article, Presbyterians in Xhosaland from Lovedale to Tutuga, published in 2022, made further reference to Christina Forsyth. So these three articles are all readily available should anyone want to find out more information. And the biography of Forsyth by Livingston is also downloadable free from the internet. I fortunately do have my own original paper copy of that. So these sources all referred to Forsyth's mission site, but none gave a precise map location, and this prompted the search to try and locate it. So just some background now on her origins. From 1876, Christina kept house for her brother at the Cairney Hill Parish Church, and the village of Cairney Hill is situated in West Fife, some 3 miles west of Dunfermline in Scotland. And the church is sited on the eastern periphery of the village. You can see there's a pin placed just below Main Street. The area was described as pleasingly undulating countryside and well-wooded, offering landscapes of considerable beauty and richness. It was at Cairney Hill in 1879 that Christina met and was engaged to the 36-year-old Alan Forsyth, a mining engineer. Alan, however, first chose to leave Scotland to work in South America and then India, and only returned in 1882. A more detailed extract from Google Earth shows the layout of the various buildings that made up the Cairney Hill Parish Church precinct, and these comprise the church, the manse or the priest's house to the west, and the session house to the south. The church cemetery is the grassed area defined by the rectilinear grid of gravestones. So the parish church is the simple building in the foreground with a traditional lime plaster finish and double-pitched slate roof. The original plan layout, dating from circa 1752, would have had a door in the east and the west gable ends, and this form of church was replicated in many of the early Presbyterian churches built in South Africa. Note the simple bell tower on the west gable and the spherical finial on the east gable. The manse or priest's house is the immediately adjacent building with a red tiled roof. It was here that Christina Moyer kept house. An aerial view of the Cairney Hill Church, and note the entrance or the current entrance door on the right of the south elevation. The session house is the small building on the left-hand side with a more recent connection into the church. The session house accommodated the Kirk sessions held at this church from 1752 right through to the 1970s, and a Kirk session of the Presbyterian Church had the status of a court of the land and was responsible for the spiritual and moral welfare of the parish. Its punishments were, however, limited to the restriction or removal of the privileges of the church. An interesting feature of the layout of this parish church is the location of the pulpit midway along the nave against the wall, with pews facing the pulpit on 3 sides. This was a traditional form for Presbyterian churches in Scotland in the 18th century. The rectangular demarcated area in front of the pulpit was restricted to only the church elders, and the gallery is supported on cast iron columns and was presumably added at some stage to accommodate an increase in the congregation. So Christina Moore first visited South Africa in 1879 when she worked at the Mgwali mission, and Tsomo, the missionary at Mgwali, had by then built this large mission church, which opened in 1862. This engraving of the mission church at Mgwali by Leon Cachet appeared on the cover of his 1888 Dutch translation of Chalmers' biography of Tsomo, and it shows the mission church as Christina Forsyth would have known it. This is, in fact, the earliest image I have found of this particular church, and it confirmed that the small projecting bay on the front facade is very early. It was not a later addition, and it was at Mgwali Mission Station that Miss Moyer was to be given her Xhosa name, Smoyana, and I'd like to read to you an extract from page 32 of Christina Forsyth of Fingoland describing this. So she found that her name was a stumbling block. There is no sound of R in Xhosa, and they could not pronounce Miss Moyer, but they soon turned it into Miss Moyana or Smoyana, by which she was ever afterwards known. As Moyana means a breath in a spiritual sense, or a little breeze, it was not an inappropriate designation for one who was destined to come into their lives so often like a breath of pure air from the fields of God. So just to give you an idea of what this church looks like today, this is a view from the southwest, and you can see it has a triangular pediment, 4 pilasters, of which we can see 2 here. And this forms a tetrastyle temple front with a bullseye ventilator, 2 blind arches, and a hammer-dressed stone plinth now painted red. Within the church itself is a fine sandstone commemorative plaque dedicated to Reverend Tsomo with a Xhosa inscription placed after his death in August 1871. And this plaque would certainly have been seen by Christina Forsyth. The inscription at the bottom right-hand corner confirms that it was carved by J. McFarlane of Dundee, Scotland. Christina Forsyth returned to Scotland in 1882 after some 3 years in South Africa, and we were fortunate that John Ross shared a copy of this marriage certificate dated 26 September 1882, copied from the National Records of Scotland. And the highlighted portion in that sort of pinkish color is relating to her marriage, and some useful details are captured on this. It records that Alan Forsyth was a mining engineer, aged 41, and that Christina Moyer was a spinster, aged 37. Alan Forsyth's father was listed as a newspaper proprietor, now deceased, and Christina's father was listed as a spirit merchant, also deceased. And apparently the population of Glasgow at that time had a serious problem with alcoholism, and her father had presumably benefited from this. Alan and Christina lived in Lydenburg in South Africa for some years, where Alan was employed as a mining engineer on the goldfields. Alan tragically drowned in February 1885, and John Ross shared a copy of the original death notice from the South African archives, printed and completed in Dutch, and the notice confirms that the couple had no children. The published notice appeared in the Inverness Advertiser some months later, which confirmed that Alan Forsyth drowned while crossing the Komati River on horseback. It was surely this calamitous event which caused Christina Forsyth to dress in black from then on and to devote the rest of her life to missionary service in South Africa. An interesting map is included in Christina Forsyth's biography, and you can see that it's titled Southeast Africa, Mission Sites of the United Free Church of Scotland, shown thus with an underlining, and you can see that there's a wide variety of sites throughout this part of South Africa. And based on this map, however, only the general location of the Xolobe mission was shown. So an extract from Google Earth shows the general area in which our 3 visits were confined. So some of the sites are shown as place marks, and the rugged nature of most of this terrain is quite clear. And just want to point out that the bright yellow line running through the center is the R352, and the screen grab suggests that this is the main road, but in reality, this is only a minor dirt road in a fairly indifferent condition. So on our first trip in September 2021, we drove through the Xolobe River Valley and spotted this interesting example of vernacular architecture at a homestead and requested permission to photograph. It was an unusual example of a thatched beehive hut, not in the traditional Nguni form of a series of intersecting semicircular rings increasing in diameter as they approach the midpoint, but using bent saplings meeting at the central support pole. On the same trip, we passed a dilapidated old house at Georgiani, almost certainly part of an old trading station. It's one of those lines of inquiry I haven't yet been able to follow up, but it certainly follows the pattern of these sort of abandoned trading stations one sees throughout the Transkei. Note the specific features dating the building to the late Victorian or early Edwardian era: the front gable, the lean-to veranda, and a hipped corrugated iron roof, the plastered coining to building corners, plastered coining to window surrounds, the fine vertically proportioned sliding sash windows, and the later intervention to brick up the lower 2/3 to solve the problem of missing glass. Again, it's a common detail you see at many of these early abandoned buildings. The galvanized OG gutters, and the ubiquitous, albeit more recent, advertising sign for Jerko tea. Then Victor Biggs, who grew up on a farm on the banks of the Great Kei near Guykerford, in fact not very far from Xolobe, spent his boyhood looking for rock art on the farm. Another important consequence of growing up on the farm was that he became completely fluent in Xhosa. In later life, his search became a magnificent obsession, and he documented rock art sites throughout the Eastern Cape. He was also determined to locate the rock art shelters that had been documented by George William Stowe in the 1860s. So Stowe was a geologist and ethnologist, and in a letter to Thomas Rupert Jones, he wrote, "During the last 3 years, I have been making pilgrimages to the various old Bushman caves among the mountains in this part of the colony and Kaffraria, and as their paintings are becoming obliterated very fast, it struck me that it would be well to make copies of them before these interesting relics of an almost extinct race are entirely destroyed." He documented a rock shelter at Xolobe, now Xolobe, on the 23rd of April, 1867. His copy of the rock art he documented is shown here, courtesy of the Stowe digital archive at the Ezekiel Museum. The ability of the rock shelter artists to observe the elephants and their calves and the manner in which they recorded the trunks, the tails, the dewlaps, their mouths, and their different modes of motion was just marvelous. Victor Biggs had searched many times in the Xolobe River Valley, but had not found the rock shelter documented by Stowe. On a final visit, he spoke to an old Xhosa man who recognized the image of the rock art shown to him and guided Victor to this large west-facing rock shelter. On our trip, we were accompanied by Victor Biggs, but the shelter is accessed down a very steep slope, and sadly, he was not strong enough to accompany us and waited on the plateau above. The sheer scale and power of the rock shelter makes a significant impression. The shelter has, however, been used for many years by goats, which have rubbed the rock face at the lower level, and the rock art has sadly been vandalized in parts. So Victor Biggs did identify and photograph the Stowe elephants and their calves in the shelter, plus the other aspects of that Stowe image. And this photo of one of the elephants and its calf confirm that while extant, the art is now significantly faded and barely exists. Perhaps not surprising, some 158 years later. And from this, it was also clear that Stowe's representation was in fact a collection of images on one page and not a precise representation of their relationship to one another. So then Ben McClellan, as I mentioned at the beginning, kindly did some de-stretch digital enhancement of some of these rock art images. And this is the first example of that image I've just shown you. Of the same elephant and calf, and it certainly makes the image much more legible. And note, for reference, the squared off recess above the elephant's tail as a reference in the next image. So this is another elephant and calf documented by Stowe, again very badly faded and probably abraded by animal movement. And the squared off recess from the previous one is now visible in the upper right-hand side corner, and you can see the elephant and the calf on the far right-hand side of the page. And then the second digital enhancement, and a lot more legible, the elephant and its calf are on a separate plane set forward from the previous elephant, also visible on the right-hand side of the image, almost creating a sense of perspective. The third Stowe elephant with the outstretched legs and another smaller elephant immediately above it. You can see just to the sort of right of the center of the page. And then this digital enhancement of this same image with the elephant visible or much more clearly visible in the upper right-hand side corner. Now on the Stowe drawing, you would have noticed that he documented some human-like figures, and these are still relatively clear on the rock face. But the digitally enhanced version, they become much more visible. And perhaps one of you would be able to explain what the significance is of the headrests or whatever they are on the heads of these figures represent. Then a very much larger and more dramatic rock art panel in the same shelter has a complex grouping of what I presume is a spirit figure and various beautifully observed animals. And this representation, apparently not recorded by Stowe, is clearly a palimpsest created over a period of time, and there's a significant damage to the surface of this rock art panel, seemingly caused by animals as well as by vandals. And the same rock art now, but now digitally enhanced. Then the last of the Stowe images, you might recall that there was a leaping buck, the bottom animal on this image, shown or documented by Stowe, and it's accompanied here by what appears to be a larger herbivore. So whether these other animals that do not appear on Stowe's drawing were painted afterwards or were just not copied by Stowe remains a question that will probably never be answered. So then what specifically piqued Victor Biggs's interest in this rock art shelter was a figure, either painted long after Stowe's visit and therefore not recorded by him, or not considered by Stowe to be significant or interesting enough to record. Victor Biggs was of the opinion that this must surely represent Christina Forsyth, a Victorian lady dressed in black with dark red trimmings. The rock art shelter was a short distance to the west of the Middle Xolobe mission station, and it would not be impossible that a later rock art painter saw Christina and depicted her in this way. Another smaller painted figure, not underneath that big rock art, not underneath the big overhang, but about 30 meters to the south, on a piece of vertical rock face, is possibly a lady holding a bag. Could it be a second representation of the same Victorian lady? I'm not sure. Anyway, I present it out of interest. So during that same site visit, or that same trip into the Transkei, a church site was found and visited, which we had presumed was the Xolobe Mission Church. But on a subsequent visit, we arrived there and there were congregants present, and they confirmed that it was St. Stephen's Anglican Church. And this is constructed in beautifully prepared and faced local stone and substantially complete and in good order, albeit with one face of the entrance painted white. An oblique view from the rear shows the significant skill employed in dressing and laying this local stone. And then a view from the interior. So this was not taken on the first trip, but on the subsequent one. It shows that the roof trusses have a raised collar, and the matched lining board ceiling rises up under the rafters and then along the underside of the collar, exposing the tie beams within the space. On our second expedition took place about a year later on the 7th of August, 2022. We were accompanied by history enthusiasts from Kumcha and again inspected the rock art shelter. On the road to Patterson Mission, we stopped at the Mbulukweza trading station, now forming part of a homestead and gently deteriorating in the sun. The early trader's name of AWC Gotch was hand-painted in a beautiful blue and yellow font over the door, and their trading interest was recorded in a similar hand-painted sign as produce buyer Mbulukweza. The church at Patterson Mission Station is aligned parallel to the contours with the length of the nave on a southwest-northeast axis. So this is the site that Christina Forsyth was present at for a short while. The church bell is supported in a small masonry structure on the west side of the church, and a small vesta is attached to the northeast end. Notice the tree in very close proximity to the southeast side of the church. You'll see, I'll show you detail in the issue that tree is creating. The mission house was described as being in close proximity down the slope. It does not survive intact, but clear evidence of a planted garden is marked with the two mature fir trees. You can see just to the left of the annotation mission house. And the linear building on the northwest side was presumably the mission school. The Patterson Mission Church is a simple linear building with attached vestry, an entrance porch set on a painted stone plinth, lancet windows and a bullseye ventilator. On visits to remote sites like this one, and in the knowledge that the buildings are reaching a point of no return, one feels compelled to record some basic dimensions, adequate to compile a basic floor plan for the record. And the simple rectangular nave you can see on the plan is divided into 7 equal bays marked on those grid lines by exposed roof trusses, with an entrance porch on the southeast side and a small vestry at the altar end. The church was rebuilt in 1882, and this date is recorded in raised plaster letters above the gable over the entrance on the southeast side. And the entrance, as I said, is badly affected by a wild fig tree. This is very often the fate of buildings in the Transkei, is that a bird drops a seed in a gutter and it starts to grow, and before long the roots have become intertwined with the fabric of the building, and it gets very difficult to remove them. And this is obviously going to cause that whole side to break off if it's allowed to grow. And within the church itself, you can see these very elegant roof trusses. You would describe them as a raised collar timber trusses, and each truss has a double sloping bottom cord formed with a round steel tie bar which connects to a vertical steel tie rod. The matched lining board ceiling in this case rises up between the exposed rafters on the underside of the purlins. Another United Free Church of Scotland church site was visited on that same trip, and again in the hope that this might be Xolobe mission station. It, however, turned out to be the Noloza outstation in Upper Xolobe. This was a humble, small-scale structure with a rectangular plan and a double-pitched roof, sadly dilapidated, but nevertheless still in use as a church. The interior suggests a congregation with very limited means simple timber benches and a table as an altar, but note the two circular badges on short posts in the far corner. And the detail of these two badges, they're somewhat time-worn and needing a bit of a clean, but they're presumably used at large church gatherings to identify the group as representatives of the Xhosa station of the Bantu Presbyterian Church, the BPC of South Africa. And I looked on Google and found that the BPC was established in 1923 out of the mission of the United Free Church of Scotland. So at that point, we had made contact with a researcher in Scotland called John Ross, and he came to me one day and said he had located a very detailed survey drawing in the UCT digital map collection titled District Map of Tsomo, Transkei, dated 1916. The original download was of low resolution and quite pixelated, but he had painstakingly scrutinized the annotations and managed to identify the relevant UFC sites. So I have, in the meantime, managed to obtain a high-resolution copy of the map, which was kindly provided by the African Historical Maps Collection, and this is the map that is presented today. So he sent me a screen grab pretty similar to this, except that on his much less good quality map. And he had identified the Patterson Mission Station at Mbulu, the single red line, bottom right-hand side. That's the church I've just shown you. He had seen the Xolobe Mission Station, which is underlined with a double red line in the middle of the page. St. Stephen's Anglican Church, the stone church that I showed you, is the church underlined with a yellow line, and Xhosa United Free Church is the double red line in the upper left-hand side. So Christina Forsyth would regularly walk between Middle Xolobe and Patterson, so between the two red marks on the right-hand side of the page, a distance as the crow flies of some 8.5 kilometers, but an actual walking distance of more like 15 kilometers over significant undulating terrain. A detailed extract from that same map I've just showed you shows the extent of the Xolobe mission station, and it records that it's the United Free Church as of 12 June 1909. The immediate vicinity of the mission site was clearly well wooded then, and the nearby minor stream was noted as the Nsinkamfu River. And what I'd particularly like to point out is the care and attention demonstrated by the representation of the topographical detail on this drawing, and the fine single-line lettering, all of which speak volumes about the graphic skills of the land surveyor involved. Then one of the benefits of Google Earth Pro is the ability to insert a scanned map into the app and manipulate the overlay until a match is achieved with the underlying aerial photograph. So the convoluted curves and bends of the Great Kai River along the lower edge of the scanned Tsomo map matched almost perfectly, and the exact site of the Xolobe mission station could now be identified. So we then were able to call for the general plans of the current general plans of the Tsomo District from the Surveyor General's office, and these were dated 1907, and sheet 2 contained the Xolobe mission station site, which we've circled in red. And this extract of that circled portion from the general plan confirms, quite sadly, that the survey drawing was a nondescript modern tracing of clearly a much earlier survey drawing. The two rivers directly adjacent to the mission station were identified as before, the Nsinkamfu River, and the other one was the Xolobe River to the south of the mission station. So once that information had been established, we could go to the Surveyor General's GIS site, where they overlay the current cadastral information on a recent aerial photograph, and this confirmed the current earth number was 442 Kaba, and also defined the area of the site. So having that information, we were now able to obtain the registered site diagram for the Xolobe mission site dated 1908, 1 year later than the general plan, and the diagram formalized what had presumably been an informal arrangement up to that time agreed to by the local chief. The diagram formed part of a title deed issued in favor of the United Free Church of Scotland, but this title deed still needs to be obtained to complete this line of inquiry. Of interest on this larger portion, or the enlarged portion on the right-hand side, is that the various buildings extant in 1908 were shown, and this picks up that there's a new church, an old church, and the house. And it's the house that was inhabited by Christina Forsyth. And we will be discussing the new church a bit later on. So if one zoomed in on this GIS, the Surveyor General's GIS aerial photograph, one can see the ruined remnants of various structures on the ground. And a preliminary attempt was made to try and identify these. So there are 2 circular structures and the remnants of 3 rectangular structures were visible. So the circular structures might have been classrooms or teachers' accommodation. And what I've also liked to particularly point out is the orange arrow, which is a route down to the bathing pool, to which reference will be made shortly. Our third expedition was in May 2023, and the Gaika Ford or Bolo drift over the Great Kai River was almost certainly used by Christina on her way from Stutterheim via Bolo over the Kai to Patterson and later to Middle Xolobe on the wagon road to Tsomo. And this view, circa 1900, is certainly the view that Christina Forsyth would have seen from the wagon road on the Transkei side. So a drift across a South African river usually involves a dolerite intrusion crossing the riverbed, which typically provided a more secure surface for the ox wagons, the carts, the horses, and pedestrians to cross. And these drifts would initially have been used by game to cross the river in the pre-colonial period. A drift on a well-traveled road often prompted the establishment of a roadside hotel, in this case the Gaikaford Hotel, visible in the middle foreground, and this provided accommodation as well as food and drink for travelers. And an area of land adjacent to the drift was typically set aside as an outspan for oxen to rest and graze. So whenever such a drift occurred on a road of some significance, the drift would clearly in due course generally be bridged. On our third trip in May 2023, we stopped to inspect the bridge and the impact of a recent significant flood event. And I happened to mention to Victor Biggs my interest in the construction of the Gaikaford Bridge, and serendipitously he mentioned that his mother, Miss Frances Acton, as a young woman in the early 1930s, was living on the nearby Stonewell farm on the west bank of the Kai and had photographed the construction of the bridge. Miss Acton was at that time riding a motorbike to and from her place of employment during the week. I don't recall the exact town, but probably in Tsomo, leaving it parked on the east bank overnight and walking over the drift in the morning and evenings. And Miss Acton carefully photographed the bridge construction with her Brownie camera and left some marvelous contemporary sepia photographs, each image no bigger than a credit card, but capturing fine details. So I've chosen to share some of these unique photographs as part of our journey. The view looks downriver towards Gaikaford Drift, as work commenced on site with the Cape Province on the right-hand side and Transkei on the left-hand side. This next image shows the excavation of the West Bank abutment, and this had commenced with large stockpiles of aggregate and crusher dust formed, probably using dolerite boulders on site with some form of steam crusher. And the photograph was clearly taken at the start of the dry season when the Great Kai River was low. And note the temporary gangplank walkway for pedestrians. The first 3 concrete piers had now been cast, and the abutment foundation was still in progress. Sadly, these photographs have no dates, so one can really only connect it to the information that is available in the Cape Archives about the construction of this bridge. All 10 piers had by now been cast, and the riverbed and the road deck commenced from the west bank. Then the bridge achieved a state of completion, and for the opening ceremony, a series of thin timber saplings were secured at intervals along both edges of the bridge, and a small welcome sign was strung between the first 2 saplings on the Transkei side, and various other flags and buntings were fixed to the others. And this rather marvelous image of the opening ceremony would almost certainly have been jointly chaired by the resident magistrates of the Tsomo and the Stutterheim districts, as the bridge would now formally link both districts. Likewise, the local population on either side of the river would have been invited. The large, certainly appreciative crowd that attended the opening ceremony almost exclusively wore hats. So this extract from the 1 in 50,000 topographical map shows the Xolobe mission station centrally within the overlaid red circle. It also confirms that the mission was located in location number 10, Kaba. We turned off the road at Kwakalehagu, underlined in red, which Xhosa toponym broadly translates as place of the pig slaughter. We parked on the high ground, close to the spot height 3362, just above Kwakalehagu, and then began a long walk down into the valley. So at this point where we parked, we were passed by 3 young men on their way to a soccer match who, after inquiring after job opportunities, asked what we were doing there. We advised them we were looking for Smoyana, and they immediately recognized the name and were most pleased by our interest. An interesting sort of social memory that young men living in this area would still remember this extraordinary woman who lived in their midst for so long. We had invited the Scottish researcher John Ross to accompany us on this 3rd visit. He was very keen, but unfortunately unable to join us, and I decided to record some video footage to better capture the sense of place to share with him, and this is one of the videos. So that school with the green roof is where we parked just behind that and made our way down. So during the mid-1950s, as I mentioned, there was a major initiative by the state to aggregate all dispersed, isolated homesteads within the Transkei and other similar so-called homelands into defined villages as a so-called betterment scheme. The Bantu Development Trust was the responsible entity, known by affected locals as the Trust, and people still talk about the Trust today. We passed numerous fragmentary remains of abandoned homesteads with finely constructed stone walls as an evocative reminder of the families who once lived in the area. A view down into the Xolobe River Valley, framed by striking euphorbia trees in the foreground, set on the edge of a vertical cliff face. The mission station site is visible in the right background. The clearly defined pathway visible in the center of the image marks the path down to Forsyth's bathing pool. And then as we proceeded closer to the mission site, we passed another very pleasant botanical surprise, which were the fine specimens of the Kai bottlebrush, Greya flanagani, a rare endemic with spectacular autumnal leaves growing right on the cliff edge. And this is a spring flowering shrub apparently with bright red bell-shaped petals. The genus records Sir George Grey. The species commemorates Henry George Flanagan, a plant collector and botanist from 1889 who farmed at Prospect Farm in the Xhosa district. We did take cuttings of the tree, but sadly none of them survived. So close to our objective, we encountered a local resident called Jack Sandile, who also knew of Smoyana and the mission station and confirmed we were on the right path. At the entrance into the mission reserve, the dry river bed here is traversed by a drift before one enters the thick grove of trees. And I'll now read again from Christina Forsyth of Fingoland, from starting at page 63. And it's really about Christina Forsyth's arrival at the mission site and her first night there. So the mission reserve was situated on a lip of land surrounded by majestic precipices and steep hillsides, covered here and there with patches of woodland or bush, and was almost completely isolated by a couple of streams which, after a series of minor falls, met and flowed on to join the Great Kai River. Down the valley, her eye rested upon high hills faced with rugged rock, clustering kraals, fertile fields, and herds of cattle and flocks of sheep and goats tended by native boys. The scarlet aloe relieved the somber greens by its splashes of brilliant color. As the fleeting changes of light and shadow settled into the soft tones of evening, the fierce and naked fronts of the heights were lit up with glory, orange and rose and purple, and then all suddenly faded into the darkness and stillness of the night, with wreaths of white mist trailing mysteriously in the dimness and lights glimmering here and there through the open doorways of huts. She lay down that night in a Xhosa hut on the tops of the boxes she had brought with her and covered herself with a shawl. But she could not sleep, and was early up and about in the morning. Xolobe in the soft clear light looked to her a gem of beauty, and with a more buoyant spirit she began that patient service which was to last without pause or respite for 30 years. So now moving into the actual site, as we were then, one of the first structures that we passed were these ruined rondavels, and I'm assuming they were probably constructed after Christina Forsyth's departure and obviously before the state removed the people at the mission station. And note particularly the type of construction where the annular, what I'm presuming are soilcrete rings, were cast in individual square segments using a movable shutter. Then moving on, our guide pointed out this fragmentary remain and said it was part of the church. And you can see this is a set of plastered steps up into the church, and lying around in the grass were a few fragments of pressed clay bricks with a frog, that triangular indentation on the top of the brick. And what was clear at this particular ruin was that these blocks that had lined up in a row formed a set of sleeper piers, which had been cut from local stone to support the timber beams, which in turn would have supported closely spaced timber joists, which in turn would have supported the tongue and groove plank floor of this particular building. And there's the second row of sleeper piers. And in the absence of any mounds marking the perimeter walls, it was clear confirmation that this had been the wooden iron church of 1905. And if I read out this extract again from Christina Forsyth of Fingoland, the idea of a church entirely of brick was abandoned, and iron lined with brick and an inner lining of wood was substituted. From Ngwali, Mr. Stewart brought a native carpenter and 2 other experienced tradesmen and set them to work. When completed, the church was a simple little building, but the people were proud of it. They had contributed £100 towards its erection, whilst the Friends in Scotland had sent out £200. And then the report that I obtained from the Corey Library on the history of Mbulu Patterson had a small aside about Middle Xolobe, as it was a sort of outstation of Mbulu Patterson and in turn of Ngwali, and it recorded this information about the present church at Middle Xolobe. It described it as the 4th church on the site, that it opened November 1905. Dimensions were noted as about 45 by 22 foot, and it was a commodious building and up to date. So no photographs of the wooden iron church at Xolobe have been located. However, this old postcard, circa 1906, a very similar timeline, is presented of another small-scale wooden iron church built in the Transkei in Flagstaff this time, the building on the left-hand side. And I would have no doubt that this would have been very similar to the Xolobe church. Effectively, it's a small-scale, prefabricated structure transported to the site and assembled. Then an online search for corrugated iron churches in Scotland brought up many similar examples, and in Scotland they refer to them as tin tabernacles. And this one is the Sire Parish Church, probably also very similar in scale and detail to the Xolobe church. So the components for such a wooden iron church would probably not have been ordered from Scotland. By this time, there was a substantial market for wooden iron buildings in South Africa, and numerous suppliers existed, all with their own catalogues of designs of numerous building types. This particular catalogue of H.V. Marsh in Pietermaritzburg included many variants of small wooden iron churches. And this is just one sample page of the many churches they offered for sale, and it's 4 small church designs, each very similar in scale to the stated dimensions of 45 foot by 22 foot, which is effectively a double square with a very pleasing proportion. And my guess is that the church on the top left-hand side is probably what the church at Middle Xolobe was based on, or was similar to. Then another document from the Corey Library, and in this, it is a brief report written by Christina Forsyth in October 1908 in a neat, legible cursive script, and some selected extracts from the report have been copied on this slide, which I'll read out. So her address was given as Greenock Schoolhouse, Middle Xolobe, UFC Outstation, October 6, 1908. The Greenock Ladies Cafrarian Society have built a comfortable cottage, the principal room being used for meetings and classes. We would gladly welcome anyone here to help us who would not be particular about what they ate or drank, or the hardness or the softness of the bed they slept on. Our heart's desire and prayer is Xolobe for Christ, Africa for Christ. Christina Forsyth. Then Mr. Mdigai, another local whom we met, led us straight to the site of the mission house, the outline now just marked with low mounds, so very clearly a brick building that has collapsed over time. So the schoolhouse or mission house was built for Mrs. Forsyth in 1889, funded by the Greenock Ladies Cafrarian Society. And in this photograph, which is the only photograph I have found of the building, Christina Forsyth is seated outside with a group of children. The house appears to be of brick, roughly rendered with plaster. Originally constructed as a rectangular plan under a steeply pitched hip roof with clipped eaves, it apparently only had 2 rooms in its original configuration. A single truncated chimney stack confirms the presence of a fireplace internally. And later additions include the internal subdivision of one of the original 2 rooms, the lean-to structure on the left-hand side, and the wooden iron room within the veranda on the right. And I'm guessing that it might well have been constructed contemporaneously with the construction of the wooden iron church, because as you can see, it is wooden iron. So then, again, in the biography, there is a description by Miss Etta M. Auld, sister of Reverend William Auld, who was missionary at Patterson Mission Station. She describes the mission house as follows. You stepped into what she called the schoolroom, a bare apartment with a table. Here she met all who came to see her. Morning and evening prayers were held, as well as the weekly prayer meeting and the women's manjano. On Saturday morning, the first early comers were wont to gather in it for a class. At the end of this room was a door which opened into her bedroom. It was simply furnished, like the rest of the house. There was a single bed from which, if you raised yourself, you could command, through the window, a view of the new church and the valley. A packing case with a drape over it served as a toilet table. A small corner bracket on which stood a travelling clock and a few photos, a small washstand, and a couple of cabin trunks completed the furnishing of the room. Stepping back into the schoolroom, you found another door leading into the dining room, which contained a table, 2 or 3 easy chairs, a folding bed, and a small table used as a sideboard, above which hung a bookcase with a few well-read and much treasured books. A door to the left as you entered led into a small pantry, while another with a glass upper half led you onto the veranda, where you could always obtain a view of the valley. At the right end of the veranda was the kitchen with a small room attached. Along the front veranda ran a rough trellis over which vines were trained, these giving cool shade and abundance of fruit in the season. So this is now my version of forensic architecture, determining the unknown from a few slender clues in the written description and from the single photograph known to exist. So what I did was to use the standard width of a door, which is just to the right of the group of people sitting next to the building, and that determined an approximate dimension of that wall of the original, or the visible portion of the wall of the original part of the building. And then I made an assumption that the width of the small window on the other original wall of the building was probably 600 millimeters or 2 foot wide, which would be a typical size of such a window. And that was then used to determine the approximate overall dimension of the other wall. And then once that had been determined, I then looked at the position of the chimney on the roof, and I superimposed a roof plan onto this rectangle, and then was able to place roughly where the chimney and the fireplace might have been. And that then said for me that the original building was only 2 rooms, so that would have then been divided by that horizontal wall. And then at some later stage, the upper room was subdivided into 2 spaces, and a pantry was added on the left-hand side, and then the veranda was occupied by a small kitchen and a room. Now, clearly the kitchen and the room sizes are unknown. It's just my guess as to what might have been an appropriate size. So that seems to accord quite neatly with the written description by Miss Auld. So this, I mentioned that Christina Forsyth regularly walked between Patterson Mission and Xolobe Mission, and our suggestion of the likely route was based firstly on a description left by Reverend Meir of Ross Mission in Mthatha, and this has been animated on this 1 in 50,000 map. So what he described is the sheep track, which after an hour became too precipitous on horseback. One's horse had to be dismounted and laid for about 15 minutes, and then it was a further hour's ride to where Forsyth lived. Another description of the same route was a long stretch through a rocky canyon, then a steep climb up mountainside covered with scrub, before a rough ride through open country, before a descent by a sheep and cattle track into another valley, whereafter a little knob of ground with huts came into view. So this is clearly all conjecture, but it seems to match the two descriptions relatively closely. But obviously, it's just our best guess. So what I've also done on this drawing is indicate the location of the rock shelter that I showed you those images from. It's immediately to the left of Xolobe Mission Station. I measured it off Google Earth. It's about 2.3 kilometers to the west of the mission station, so not very far at all. Then Miss Auld was a talented artist, and the biography includes this black and white drawing. It would be very nice to find the original colored version if it still exists. But this is the view that would have been seen by Christina Forsyth from her house. I did take a similar view. I should have moved forward by maybe about 20 meters and I would have got an even closer view to match the previous watercolor painting. Then this is a photograph contained in the biography of the handing over of the school to the government teacher in 1900, and Christina Forsyth on the right-hand side. But what is interesting is the construction of the schoolhouse is that the original construction probably had clipped eaves, much like her own mission house, and it's probable that there was a later addition of a veranda. You can see these perimeter veranda supported on very rough wooden poles that creates a sort of protective space around the building. Then another video, and if I just read the next extract from Christina Forsyth of Fingoland, and this is really about her habit of using the river as a place to have a bath. So now and again, they endeavored almost surreptitiously to send out little articles that might conduce to her well-being. They also consulted Miss Auld when she was in Scotland. So sorry, this is the ladies of the Greenock Cafrarian Society wanting to assist Miss Forsyth, Mrs. Forsyth. They resolved to dispatch a bath and an easy chair to Xolobe. On Miss Auld's return to Patterson, she dropped a casual hint as to what was coming, whereupon Mrs. Forsyth reached hastily for pen and paper and wrote to Miss McFarlane. We have excellent bathing facilities here, and an easy chair would be a cumbersome thing to get here, as there is no traffic by wagon. So if you would not be offended, I would rather not receive them. We have an excellent water supply within 5 minutes' walk of the house. Later, however, when she grew feebler and was unable to go to the river, she proposed to buy a bath. Miss Auld hurried one up from Patterson for her use until she could procure another on behalf of the Greenock ladies from the nearest store, and congratulated herself on at last having achieved a distinct victory over the scruples of her friend. And when she was actually permitted to sit beside Smoyana and darn her stockings, she felt that the citadel of independence, hitherto so impregnable, had fallen at last. And then this is another video of that walk. It's not the entire walk, but it gives you an idea of the sort of walk that Christina would have had every time she went down the river to bath. So the biography included a photograph of what was called Smoyana's bathing place. So we had made a photostat of this and had brought it along in the hope that we would, if we had had to wander around the site, that we would have found it. But fortunately, our guide, Mr. Ndigaye, knew of this bathing spot, and he took us down this long precipitous route at not an easy walk. It must have been quite trying for Christina to do it every now and then. But this photograph confirms that we were sighted at exactly the right spot. And then this next video shows the context of the stream and Smoyana's bathing pool. So the bathing pool is the one next to which those three people were standing. And it's just looking back towards the downstream of the river. That big cliff apparently used to accommodate vultures, so we were told. So then Christina left Middle Xolobe in 1916 when she was getting quite frail and unable to cope, and was taken to Love's Drift on the Tsomo River, where she was collected with a motor car, the first she had seen. She returned to Scotland via ship in the middle of the First World War at risk of being torpedoed by German U-boats. So the description of her being the loneliest woman in Africa is perhaps only the perception of someone viewing her situation from abroad. I have no doubt that she was in fact surrounded, appreciated, and included by the community she served for so many years. The biography described her return to Scotland, and the author concluded by asking her a significant question to which she provided an interesting response. So I'll now read the final extract from the closing pages of the last chapter of Christina Forsyth of Fingoland. Smoyana, said the writer to her one day in summer when she was sitting looking out upon the beautiful sunlit hills of the homeland, if you had the chance, would you go back and live these 30 years over again at heathen Xolobe? Yes, was the quick but quiet reply. I should like to do better than I have done. But you have done a tremendous lot. Her eyes filled with tears. I have done very little, she said simply. I should like to do much more before I die. And that brings that talk to an end. Thank you very much. I'd obviously be happy to answer any questions on my presentation.
Thanks very much. I see there's some hands applauding. But yeah, it's very interesting to see how you explored to kind of track where she'd been and actually found some of the places that she'd lived at. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to stop the recording now, and then you're welcome to ask them. You're welcome to